A wild bobcat hurled itself against a cage wall, snarling and clawing, not to escape, but to reach a tiny crying kitten on the other side. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, unnatural. Yet what the vets discovered about their bond left everyone fighting back tears. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. In the muted gray light of that chilly morning, Dr. Emily Harris stood at the threshold of Clearwater Animal Clinic, her breath a pale mist in the air, watching as the rescue team carefully unloaded the transport cage. Inside, pressed tightly together, were two figures that defied every natural instinct she had come to expect. A full-grown bobcat, muscles tense under a battered coat of fur, and a trembling kitten no bigger than a coffee mug, its wide, tear-wet eyes blinking up at the world. The bobcat's body formed an unbreakable fortress around the kitten, her tail wrapped delicately over its back, her ears flicking in constant alertness. Emily's fingers tightened around the clipboard she had brought out more out of habit than need. Her mind raced through possibilities, rabies, trauma, territorial confusion, but none of them could explain the silent, almost reverent way the bobcat shielded the kitten, nor the kitten's absolute trust as it nestled against the wild animal's ribs. Instincts should have driven the bobcat to flee or fight, or at least show restless agitation at captivity. Instead, there was a heartbreaking stillness in the pair, a fragile, trembling bond that seemed spun from grief itself. Jake Matthews, the hiker who had found them, shifted awkwardly nearby, his rugged face pale beneath his baseball cap. "She wouldn't leave it," he said quietly, voice rough from the cold or the emotion. Emily couldn't tell which. "She growled at me when I got too close, but only when I reached for the kitten. Otherwise, she just kept her body between us." Inside the clinic, techs scrambled to prepare two adjoining enclosures, speaking in hushed voices, as if afraid any loud sound might shatter the strange spell that had fallen over them all. Emily crouched by the cage, peering into the bobcat's wary, gold-flecked eyes. There was fear there, yes, but also a deeper emotion, something far more human, defiance laced with desperate protectiveness. They moved slowly, with the kind of care usually reserved for diffusing explosives. When the cage was opened, the bobcat hesitated only a moment before stepping out, her muscles rippling in smooth, cautious movement. She gave a warning snarl when a vet tech tried to reach for the kitten, but when Emily knelt, hand extended palm up, murmuring low, meaningless reassurances, the kitten took a stumbling step forward, only for the bobcat to immediately nose it back toward her body. It was not aggression. It was an oath, an unspoken vow stitched from loss and instinct, grief and stubborn hope. Emily felt something inside her chest shift, some fragile wall buckling under the weight of what she witnessed. This was no accident. Something ancient and sacred had been broken, and something else, equally ancient, had taken root in its place. Dr. Harris worked with methodical urgency, her hands steady even as unease curled at the edges of her mind. The kitten was a skeleton wrapped in matted fur, its bones fragile under her gloved fingers, the wound on its hind leg raw and angry. They flushed the gash, cleaned it meticulously, and wrapped it in gauze so fine it barely seemed to touch the tender skin. The kitten whimpered in a rasping voice that broke the silence of the clinic like thin ice cracking underfoot. Emily exchanged glances with her senior tech, Marcus Reed, who raised an eyebrow, a silent acknowledgement that this was no ordinary case. Meanwhile, behind a plexiglass barrier, the bobcat's behavior deteriorated. At first she paced, a low growl reverberating from deep in her chest, her paws tapping a restless rhythm on the sterile floor. When the kitten's cries sharpened, the bobcat erupted, hurling herself at the transparent wall, teeth flashing, claws raking soundlessly. Each impact was a visceral expression of pure panic, a mother's rage against unseen captors. The kitten responded just as desperately. It clawed weakly at the blanket in its crate, trying to scramble toward the direction of the snarls. Its mewling sharpened, raw and frantic, and with each anguished sound, the bobcat grew wilder. Staff members who had witnessed savage animals cornered and trapped now watched in stunned sympathy. This wasn't territorial aggression. This was loss, translated into fury. In the staff meeting that followed, Emily found no satisfaction in authority. "We can't separate them," she said finally, her voice cutting through the tangle of arguments about liability, instinct, and policy. "Not yet. It's too dangerous. For the kitten, and for her." A reluctant nod from Marcus closed the discussion. They prepared a double enclosure, half veterinary ICU, half reinforced holding pen, laced with every precaution they could devise. And then, astonishing calm. Once the kitten was gently placed beside her, the bobcat's rage evaporated as if a switch had been thrown. She lowered her massive head and began grooming the kitten with soft, deliberate strokes, each swipe of her tongue careful around the bandaged leg. She pushed pieces of moist food toward the kitten, ignoring her own untouched tray. When the kitten trembled with fever, she wrapped her sinewy body around it like a living shield, her eyes heavy with vigilance, never fully closing. Emily watched, heart knotted, from behind a thick pane of glass. This was no mere aberration of instinct. This was something deeper, elemental. A silent scream stitched into flesh and fur, a grief so profound it had been transfigured into guardianship. The clinic's overhead lights buzzed softly, sterile and cold, but inside that enclosure, something raw and ancient lived. Something no medical textbook could explain, and no rational mind could deny. The diagnosis fell over the room like a heavy shroud. Dr. Emily Harris held the X-ray film up against the light, tracing the faint outlines with a numb hand. There was no mistaking it. The bobcat's body bore every unmistakable sign of recent birth. The softened pelvis, the lingering vascular changes, the slight sag of her belly where milk had once flowed. She had been a mother only days, perhaps hours, before fate stripped her of that right. Yet nowhere, not on the trail, not in the surrounding woods, had there been any sign of her cubs. They were simply gone, lost to the brutal indifference of the wild. Emily laid the film down slowly, her fingers trembling before she forced them still. Around her, the room pulsed with an unnatural silence. Marcus leaned against the counter, his jaw set hard, the muscles ticking with the effort to contain the surge of emotion clawing its way up his throat. Across the room, Linda, their most stoic vet tech, wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, pretending to examine a clipboard. No one spoke. There were no words. Through the observation window, the bobcat could be seen curled around the kitten, the rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing strangely hypnotic. Every so often she emitted a soft, vibrating hum from deep in her chest, a lullaby for a child who was not hers, a desperate echo of comfort she refused to surrender. Jake Matthews, who had refused to leave even after the rescue was complete, sat slumped in the corner on a battered vinyl chair, his hands hanging loosely between his knees. He stared at the two figures beyond the glass, his weathered face carved with raw disbelief. When he finally spoke, his voice barely rose above a whisper, ragged and hollow. "She lost everything," he said, the words rasping like wind over stones. "And she chose to love again." No one corrected him. No one dared to break the fragile thread that tethered them to that moment. The knowledge sank into Emily's chest like a stone. Not just the fact of the bobcat's loss, but the enormity of her response. Nature was cruel, yes, but it was also filled with strange mercies. This broken-hearted creature, denied her own young, had not turned to rage or despair. She had chosen something infinitely braver, to nurture, to protect, to stitch her shattered soul to the frail heartbeat of a crying stranger. It was a decision no logic could explain, and no science could fully define. It was grief, weaponized into devotion. It was love, raw and defiant, clawing its way back from the abyss. The decision had been agonizing, weighed down by sleepless nights and endless consultations. Release was impossible. Willow was no longer the wary, aloof predator nature had intended. Her bond to humans, and more crucially to Milo, was stitched too tightly into her survival instincts now. She had traded the brutal lessons of the wild for something softer, something far more fragile. Yet, to separate her from the kitten, to tear open that fresh seam of healing, would have been an act of cruelty so profound it mocked the very spirit that had brought them together. So the team at Clearwater found a middle path, one shaped by compromise and hope. They reached out to a renowned wildlife sanctuary on the outskirts of the county, a sprawling, sun-drenched refuge nestled against ancient pine woods and rolling hills. There they designed a special enclosure, a sanctuary within a sanctuary, one where Willow could roam freely among trees and rocks, yet always keep Milo within the protective curve of her watchful body. When the day came to move them, it felt more like a coronation than a transfer. The clinic staff gathered quietly, watching as Willow padded into her transport crate without struggle, Milo tucked safely against her chest. It was a solemn procession, marked not by sorrow but by a quiet, trembling reverence. The new enclosure was a world unto itself, wild enough to feel like freedom, secure enough to offer peace. Willow explored it cautiously at first, her lean frame weaving through tall grasses, her nose lifted to catch every scent on the breeze. Milo, still wobbly on his growing legs, scampered behind her, occasionally tumbling into tufts of clover, only to be righted by a gentle nudge of Willow's nose. Weeks blurred into months. Milo grew robust, his coat sleek and shining under the sanctuary sun. He invented games only a kitten could imagine, leaping onto Willow's broad back, ambushing her tail, sprinting mad circles around her until he collapsed in panting heaps of purrs. Through it all, Willow remained his fierce, patient guardian, tolerating his antics with a depthless well of maternal devotion. Over time, she even learned to trust Emily and Jake, recognizing the voices that never carried threat, the hands that only ever brought food, fresh water, and care. She would allow them close, not too close, but close enough to witness the miracle she protected. One evening, as the sun bled gold and crimson across the horizon, Emily stood at the edge of the enclosure, watching the two souls she had once feared would be broken beyond repair. Willow lounged beneath a leaning oak, her eyes half closed in contentment, while Milo nestled against her side, batted lazily at a drifting leaf. Emily's voice was barely more than a breath against the twilight. "Sometimes," she whispered, "the heart finds a way to love again, even when it's been shattered." And in that sacred space, where loss had been alchemized into something pure and enduring, love, fierce, wild, and unbreakable, had carved out a new home.